right to it, if that's okay, Cathy.
That's great. Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you for that wonderful introduction.
All right. So this book is new. It's your latest. When people ask you what it's about, what do you tell them?
I say that it's a story about the wonder and the complexities of friendship and love and belonging. And then I tell them a little about the plot. So I'll share that, if I may.
Yeah.
When forced to leave her beloved Prince Edward Island, which I just love Prince Edward Island.
We're going to talk about that. Yes.
Yes. Adelaide Rose MacNeill, after the tragic death of her parents, is forced to go to a boarding school in Farmington, Connecticut. And she really doesn't want to go, but when there, she never expected to find three kindred spirits, three sisters of the heart, Dorothy and Ruth and Susanna. And the girls quickly bond like sisters. And they call themselves the Ladies of the Lake because the school is Lakeside Ladies Academy. And they vow to be there for one another through thick and thin all their lives. And that works great until love and jealousy come between the two closest of the friends, Adelaide or Addie and Dorothy. Before World War I, the Great War upends their world and casts baseless suspicion on the German-American man that they both love. And before a terrible explosion in the Halifax Harbor rips the sisterhood irrevocably apart. But 17 years later, Dorothy, who is now headmistress of Lakeside Ladies Academy, places an unsuspecting telephone call to Rosalind Murray, who has a daughter at the school. And Rosalind has refused to come to the graduation, but Dorothy tries to convince her. And with that telephone call, Rosalind is drawn into a past that she had determined to put behind her, to memories of a man she once loved, to a sisterhood she abandoned, and to the day that she stopped being Adelaide Rose MacNeill. So I hope there's some intrigue there to wet your whistle.
I love stories where a character assumes a new identity to escape their past or whatever. So yeah, you had me at that identity switch. I think that's always a really cool twist in the story. So good. I know I'm always interested in where an idea for a book comes from. And I know one of the participants tonight asked this question ahead of time too. And that is like, where did the inspiration come from? How did you land upon this idea for a book?
Well, for each of my books, I feel that the Lord presses on my heart something that is really important, something that I think either makes him rejoice or grieves his heart, that also makes me rejoice and grieves my heart. And in this case, there were a few things. One was the friendship of women. We really need each other. We need sisters of the heart. And of course, I've always admired and loved the writing of Lucy Maud Montgomery, and the friendship of her heroine, Anne and Diana in Anne of Green Gables, certainly influenced me and inspired some of the friendship of the girls. But also the thing that really has grieved my heart is the bullying that I see in the world today and in our country, certainly. I see it on social media. I see it in politics. I even see it in church. And it really breaks my heart to see the filters off people. You know, it's so easy to just say things, to think that we're entitled to say things, but we need to understand the consequences of those and how those hard things might affect other people. So I work that into the story. And that's really important to me. I was also inspired by Joseph, the biblical story of Joseph, and how he was really terribly wronged by his brothers and abused. And yet he ended up in a place where he changed his identity. He even had a new name. And through taking good out of the experiences that he went through, rather than just becoming bitter, he was ultimately able to not only help his family, but save his family, save the people who abused him. So there's a similar thread like that runs through the story. And also I was inspired by the moment that I read John U. Bacon's book, The Great Halifax Explosion. I knew I wanted to set the story there. And it just worked perfectly for so many reasons that we can talk about later. But before the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima, the Great Halifax Explosion was the biggest man-made explosion in the history of the world. And I had never heard of it, which just amazed me because I've read a lot of history. So that was really fascinating, reading about the devastation, the lives lost, and how many people were crippled or blinded. And that reminded me of my mother. My mother was, as a very young child, was badly burned, and she carried those scars all her 96 years, but she didn't let them define her. They affected her, certainly, but that tragedy did not define her life. And so that was an inspiring thread for me to weave through the story as well. And there again, in the explosion, there were people who used that opportunity when all these records were destroyed and so many people were absolutely incinerated, that they reinvented themselves. They decided they would have a new identity. So that was fascinating. And I'd say lastly, I've always been fascinated by the idea of growing up in a girls' boarding school. I didn't do that, but I think I've always romanticized stories about that. So I wanted to explore that. What would it be like to have close friends and have all kinds of escapades? So that was really fun to weave in. I think it was a combination of all those things.
Oh, that is great. So I want to focus in on those friendships then. The four characters, you see them on the front of the book here, and of course are all over the pages of the book. And those friendships, and when they're younger, Adelaide goes by Addie, correct? And Dorothy goes by Dot. And they seem to me kind of like the two lead characters. And then we have Susanna and Ruth, who are also part of the Ladies of the Lake. So if you could just describe for me in broad terms, if you can, their personalities, what differentiates them, and then what brought them together? Like, why did those four personality types get together?
Okay. Yes, Addie certainly misses her parents. She's an orphan, and she longs for family, for love and acceptance and belonging. And she tends to feel inferior because she doesn't have a family. At Christmas, when the other girls go home, she has nowhere to go, really. But she also has a keen imagination, and she dreams of becoming a famous writer someday, like Lucy Maud Montgomery, who was also from Prince Edward Island and who was also an orphan. So that's Addie. Dot is a little more complicated. She's a local girl, lives on a farm locally to the school, and is at the school on scholarship. And she feels a bit inferior because of that. But she really wants to grow beyond her boundaries. She wants to achieve great things. And she is smitten with the boy next door. But she finds herself living in Addie's shadow quite a bit academically and in the eyes of this young man. She longs to become the headmistress someday of Lakeside Ladies Academy, but she also fears that might go to Addie, that privilege. So she's fiercely loyal and supportive on the one hand of her friends, and on the other, she's a bit competitive and can even be a little vindictive. Ruth is, I would say, the genius among the group. She's a scientist and engineer by nature. She's a natural-born leader, and she can really convince people of things. But Ruth also can move forward a little bit with blinders on. When her brother is killed in the sinking of the Lusitania, she becomes very anti-German. And this affects the sisterhood because of reasons. I don't want to give everything away, but this really affects the sisterhood. So she sees them as the enemy, and that's a tough thing in the sisterhood. Susanna, I would say she's the Southern Belle among the group. She's from the Carolinas, and her mother has really determined her future. She expects Susanna to graduate from Lakeside Ladies Academy and be presented in society at a debutante ball and marry and have children and help the family continue to rise up the social and political ladder. Susanna also has the great ability to motivate people, which comes into play pretty far into the book, but she has a great ability. She has an uncanny ability to climb trees as a young girl. So you know that there's more to her than her mother meets her mother's eye. But Susanna can also be a little catty and self-centered. So I would just want to say that I love these characters. They're wonderful, and yet they're flawed, just like all of us.
Yeah.
Combinations.
Oh, that sounds great. I want to talk next about how you approached the research. You mentioned that you had not heard of the Halifax disaster. I hadn't either until I read your book. So I know you probably had to do a dive there to understand what happened there. But you must have also, maybe you went to Prince Edward Island. I think I read that you did. Tell us all about your research. How did you undertake this project and gather everything you needed to write the book?
Okay, well, this was shortly before the pandemic, and it was going to be the anniversary trip of a lifetime. My husband and I went to Nova Scotia. He'd always wanted to see the Maritimes. I had always wanted to go to Prince Edward Island and see everything. Lucy Maud Montgomery. I was able to see her birthplace, her grave, and her husband's grave, and Park Corner, which was her girlhood haunt, the place that inspired Green Gables, and that is now the Anne of Green Gables Museum.
Wow.
It was wonderful. It was just wonderful. And we went to Charlottetown and saw an Anne of Green Gables musical. Mm-hmm. So all of those things were wonderful for me. And I read all of Lucy Maud Montgomery's published journals. And as far as I know, I've read all of her published works. So I'm a big fan. In Halifax, that was just amazing. Before we went on the trip, because I knew we were going there, I read John U. Bacon's book, The Great Halifax Explosion, and that sealed it for me. I knew that I wanted to include that in the story. It fit the timeline perfectly, and the fact that so many people were crippled and blinded, and some people reinvented themselves, all of that. But Halifax was fascinating. I went to the Immigration Museum there at Pier 21, and the let's see, what is it called? The Atlantic Museum, Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. And there at the time, they had the most thorough exhibition about the Halifax explosion. It was wonderful. You could hear testimonies, you could hear recorded testimonies, you could see all kinds of newspaper archives and pictures that had been taken. The bookstore had a wealth of information that I was able to buy from my research. And all over Halifax, there are memorials in different ways to the Halifax explosion, because people looked at that explosion like life before the Great Halifax Explosion, life after. And one of the most poignant for me was the town hall clock in the center of town. I think the clock that's there now is a reproduction of the original one, but it was stopped at the exact moment of the explosion and will never be changed. So when I still have goosebumps when I think about that. Yeah. There was also the Memorial Bell Tower on a hill, these giant, giant bells, beautiful. And one of the places that was also very poignant for me was Fairview Cemetery. And that is where the unidentified remains of victims are buried. But also it's the place where victims from Titanic are buried. So seeing both of those things just, and I've written about both of those things. I wrote about Titanic and Promise Me This years ago. And it was just very, very moving for me.
Mhm.
Let's see what else. Oh, and finally, on our way home, we stopped in Farmington, Connecticut, and that's where I set Lakeside Ladies Academy. It's modeled very much after Miss Porter's school. Miss Porter's is a school that's, I think, was started in the 1800s by a lady named Miss Porter, but a number of notable women have gone there. Jacqueline Bouvier, Kennedy Onassis, and a number of other women attended the school there. So I read a history about that book. I mean, I read a history book about that school. And that was very interesting because they had some very unique traditions, which I then wove similar things into the book. But I will say about that explosion, and besides that, I did interview some people. I watched documentaries and interviewed a number of people who had either memories of parents or grandparents from the time period. That explosion in Halifax was just devastating. And what happened is that there were two ships, the Norwegian Emu and the Mont Blanc, collided. Now, if they had just been regular ships, it would have been an insurance issue that would have faded into history. But the Mont Blanc was loaded with munitions that had picked up in New York, and it was bound for the war effort in Bordeaux, France. And they were going to be in the Halifax Harbor before they joined I can't think of the word now, but a group of ships going together. So when they bumped, it was a huge explosion. It wiped out the town of Richmond, the area of Richmond in Halifax. Windows 50 miles away were blown out. The roofs were blown off. The area where the Mi'kmaq, the indigenous First Nation people lived, and that's where one of my characters, Portia, had lived before the explosion. So many people were killed. So between the flying debris and the fires that destroyed the buildings, 25,000 people were homeless and without shelter. 9,000 were wounded, including 200 that were blinded, and nearly 2,000 people were killed. Many just upon impact. And to give an idea of the force of that explosion, the anchor from the Mont Blanc weighed over 1,100 pounds. It was blown 2.5 miles away. But one of the reasons that so many people were blinded is that the collision happened early in the morning, and people way up on the hill could look down at the harbor, but they were looking through their windows. So when that explosion happened, all that glass went into their eyes.
Oh my goodness.
And, it was just so devastating. I think I could not believe that I had never heard of it. But one interesting thing I read is that people who were blinded and burned wanted mostly to stay there in Halifax because it was not uncommon to see people maimed or blinded or burned. You didn't feel people were staring at you. You felt this was more normal in that generation. And that was so partly sad, but also I could understand the comfort of that.
Yeah.
Very unique.
Wow. That's incredible. All of those details that you were able to find and kind of bring some humanity to that disaster. Because I think disasters of that magnitude should be remembered because of the people whose lives were either changed or taken. Amazing.
Yes. Yeah, they're
So
not just statistics.
go ahead.
They're not just statistics. They're
Exactly.
real
Exactly.
people.
Yeah. So I'm also a Lucy Maud Montgomery fan. I've read all of the Anne of Green Gables books. So I have that bucket list trip on my list too, the trip to PEI. And I have always been enamored of that friendship between Anne Shirley and Diana Barry. And I think that also inspired you, this friendship, that if any of you viewers have not read those books, they're classics, they're wonderful. I would say, were you inspired by that friendship to create friendships of your own in this book, and in what way?
Certainly, certainly. I've always thought it was wonderful how Anne and Diana were kindred spirits. And the really neat thing is that they were not at all alike. They were so different.
Right? Yeah, they're very different.
Yeah. And in their hopes and their dreams and their upbringing and their backgrounds, they were so different, but they were kindred spirits, and they were true sisters of the heart. And that's what I wanted to show, is that, when friends are really supportive of one another, they don't try to make or clone one another, make one in their image or clone one another. They support the dreams and the joys of each other. So I wanted to show that, and I was inspired by them. I was also inspired by the sisterhood in Little Women, Meg and Jo and Amy and Beth, how they were all very different, and yet they loved each other. But also Diana and Anne especially got into quite a number of scrapes, and sometimes they were disciplined, sometimes they were separated, but they remained friends, and they saw the value of nurturing their friendships. So yeah, they definitely inspired me.
Yeah. So you mentioned in your author's note that even the best of friendships can be sorely tested. And I'm just wondering, what do you think comes between friends? And then what do you think draws them back together?
Well, I think just any number of things can come between friends. Time and distance, we can just naturally grow apart, and that can fray a friendship, and it can be lost if people don't actually take proactive steps to nurture and maintain that friendship. But also bigger things, like things that happened in the book, jealousy or competitions or bullying, secrets, lies, shame, arguments. All of those things can actually break a friendship. And if that happens, then you need even more than being a proactive nurturer. You have to look the thing in the face, like the girls in the story or the women in the story finally do. And you have to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Will you forgive me? Can we begin again? And that only will happen if both parties deem the friendship worth saving and both parties invest. But somebody has to take the first step.
Right? Isn't that so true with relationships, especially friendships? Because friendships are the relationships that we can choose to abandon, and nobody looks down on you. If you abandon a spouse, there's societal ramifications of that. But if you decide to abandon a friend, just like end or sever the friendship, nobody ever asks you why, or hold you to account. So yeah, I think our friendships give us our best opportunities to improve ourselves,
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, because we're not bound by societal expectations of bonds that can't be broken.
Yeah. The one thing I would say that can be different about that is if a friendship becomes toxic for some reason.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Unhealthy, then you don't want to maintain that, for your own sake, and also for the sake of the other person who will continue to perhaps misuse or abuse the relationship.
Yeah.
But we're able to tell that eventually. Maybe not at first sometimes.
Maybe not at first, right. But eventually, it comes to light if there's going to be a problem in that area. So I'm wondering if the writing of this novel, if it changed you in any way. Did it broaden your perspective on anything, or did you learn something new besides the Halifax disaster? I know that was new, but what else did you learn that was either new or surprising, or how were you changed in the writing?
I think the Halifax explosion was the thing that I learned that was new, and all of the details that went with that, and the ongoing issues from that. But certainly, I think that the whole issue about forgiveness and doing good for others was underlined for me. How important that is, and how important it is to take the first step, to not wait. If you feel you've been wronged, well, so what? I don't mean that callously either, but sometimes we just have to say the friendship is worth it,
Right.
and move
Yeah.
forward. So I spent a lot of time reading Joseph's story and saw how God changed his heart, and his maturity matured him through all his hard experiences. He had wealth, he had prison, he had great wealth and influence, and he could have kept that for himself, but he didn't. He really blessed his family for generations. And it was interesting to me to explore the whole thing about bullying and the white feather. Now, I had heard about the white feather, especially in World War I. I'd heard about it in World War II as well, but especially World War I. And some of the girls gave that as a symbol of cowardice to young men who were of an age to enlist and hadn't. But, we don't always know why somebody doesn't choose to do something we think that they should. And in the story, there were terrible ramifications. And that I will say is something that really has come home to me. I don't think I'm a cruel person, and I don't think I speak callously to people, but it has made me very conscious of the words that I say and the attitudes that I present to people. We live in a really tough world, and it's getting tougher all the time. So we need the encouragement of one another. We need smiles. We need appreciation, and we have the opportunity to do that, to be that person. So I think all of those things were underlined for me as I worked on the book.
And I was wondering if you could tell us what your favorite scene was to write, and perhaps you might even want to read that for us. But we would love to hear what was your favorite scene, and then if you would, maybe just read a little excerpt so we can hear the story in your own.
Oh, I would love to tell you about that. The whole bullying theme goes through the book in many places, but some more serious than others. But there's this one place when the girls are about 12 years old, and there is an older girl, a senior girl, who is very, very mean to them. She just does all kinds of mean things, damaging their artwork, putting water in their beds to make it look like they've wet their beds, all kinds of needling, mean things. And the girls decide that they've got to stop this. They've got to do something about it. Well, they try humiliating her, and that backfires big time. So they're discussing, well, what can we do? And Ruth, the leader among them, says, she needs to be afraid of us. And Suzanne's like, well, what's to fear? We're just kids. What's to fear? And Ruth says, fear itself. So she asks Addie what she's going to recite this month in November. And Addie says, oh, I'm going to recite The Highwayman by Alfred Noyes. It's thrilling and ghostly, and Miss Weston gave me permission. And as you read this, you'll get a little flavor of Anne of Green Gables in this, or Anne of Avonlea. And so Ruth says, well, then I think it's up to me. I think a little rapping at her chamber door might be in order. So Addie says, Poe, and Ruth says, Edgar Allan. And the girls huddle closer. So I want to read a little about that now. Dot borrowed, this is from Addie's viewpoint, Dot borrowed the metal nut and fishing line from Mr. Potts' tool shed outside young Clem's stable. Susanna, whom no one would have imagined a tree climber, faked a stomachache at dinner to be excused from the dining room, and later told us how she'd scurried up the maple outside the senior girls' housing. In the meantime, the rest of us kept innocent faces over beef stew and Mrs. Potts' melt-in-your-mouth biscuits. Susanna attached the fishing line and nut to dangle outside the window pane of Mildred's room, then threaded the long end of the line through the leafless boughs of the maple. After dinner, we gathered in the assembly room for our monthly Saturday night program. recitations or tableaus or comedy skits or debates, whatever our teachers had assigned. The first form girls created tableaus of the first Thanksgiving feast. Third form girls put on a skit inspired by Longfellow's Hiawatha. At last it was time for second form. Two girls recited ahead of us. For the life of me, I could not tell you what they said. I was that nervous. My turn came for the highwayman. I poured every ounce of dramatic flair I possessed into the poem, tossing the moon as a ghostly galleon upon cloudy seas, weaving the road in a ribbon of moonlight, brandishing my rapier to the sky, and finally grasping the bunch of lace at my throat, once the highwayman was shot down like a dog to die on the highway. Silence followed my recitation. Then an expansion of held breath, cheers and clapping swept through the students, and Miss Weston looked proud enough to cry. If ever I felt a part of something at Lakeside Ladies Academy, it was in that moment. I almost regretted what we were about to do. Ruth recited last, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Among the four of us, Ruth was the genius, intellectual, studious, a scientist and engineer by nature. She also possessed the uncanny ability to quietly convince. From the moment she began, once upon a midnight dreary, we each sat alone in that darkened room, ghastly images from Poe's ghosts stretching their limbs against the far wall in the waning firelight, the flickering lamplight. We each heard the barely perceptible rapping at a time no mortal should walk. We observed the wretched bird perched above our chamber door with its doomed and chilling message, nevermore. Tension mounted. Electric currents passed from girl to girl, raising the very hairs on our arms. Each time Ruth whispered, quoth the raven. We whispered, breathless in return, nevermore. We leaned forward in our seats, nerves stretched taut like springs of clocks wound too tight. By the time Ruth screamed, pleading, take thy beak from out my heart and take thy form from off my door, we were ready to swoon or race from the room. When the poem finally ended on a note so sinister and low that we had to lean forward to hear, we were spent and terrified to walk across the campus to our dormitory houses in the dark. That was quite a recitation. Miss Weston, nervous fingers at her throat, congratulated Ruth on our way out the door. Thank you, Miss Weston. I hope so. So the girls follow Ruth across the field to their home, to their dormitory, and they wait till they put nightgowns over their clothes, pretend they're sleeping in their bed, and they wait until the downstairs clock bongs 11:30. And then they tie a knotted rope, which Dot had also procured from Mr. Potshed, to the nearest bedstead, and they lower Dorothy and Addie down. And Susanna says, sure y'all don't want me to go? Susanna offered, I'm the fastest tree climber. No, you and Ruth have done enough. It's our necks we're risking now and should be. I was firm about that. Just be ready with the rope when we return. Right, Dot agreed, tying the rope around my waist and pulling it up beneath my armpits. Equal shares. The girls helped me out the window. I went down slowly. Dot followed. The rope went up a final time and the window closed. We made our way through the shadows, hard pressed not to let our imaginations run wild amid the wind-tossed branches in the near moonless night. By the time we reached the tree outside Mildred's window, we were freezing. Our fingers so cold we could barely grasp the lower limbs to climb. Once up in the tree, we waited for the school tower clock to bong midnight. And that's as far as I'm going to read. And if you want to know what they did and if they were caught,
I think people should buy the book, right?
Yeah, if there are repercussions, you have to buy the book and find out. You have to at least read the book.
You should. Everyone really should buy the book. I've read the book. It's wonderful. And this is the one time when you buying this particular book of Cathy's will benefit it'll benefit Save Ellis Island. It'll help preserve these buildings they're historical in nature. They're irreplaceable. but they are crumbling and they need our help. So you should order the book from Save Ellis Island. Cathy has signed book plates, so it'll be a signed copy, and you'll be able to find out what these girls do. So,
I will say that that story of what they actually do was one that my father-in-law told me, that he and his
really?
friends played as a prank when they were young during the Great Depression. And he's no longer with us, but I think he would get a real kick out of reading what they did. And I
I
hope
love it when authors stories from either recent past or remote past show up in the pages of the book. I think that is great.
it's
Well, I have
fun.
some other questions I wanted to ask you. We also need to be watching the time. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions in the chat. So if you are watching and you have a question that you would like me to ask Cathy during Q&A, you can start putting those in, and I will scroll back to see if I can find them all so that we can ask your questions. And I'm sure Cathy's happy to answer anything that you might want to know. I think I'll ask you next, how does this book compare with your others? I've read some of your other books. What would you say how this book is alike or different? And do you seem to land on the same themes? Like, do you find yourself either bending towards particular themes that show up often in your books?
I think that I do. I've already mentioned that I always begin with something that the Lord presses on my heart. So there's that. That's sort of a signature thing for me. I often will bring in a real life character or the writings of a real life character that I want to reintroduce readers to or make sure that they know about, the people that have inspired or blessed me.
Mm-hmm.
And most of my books deal with oppression in some way, whether it's physical oppression like slavery or the terrible things that happened in the Holocaust, or racial issues that have happened in our own country, or so the chains that bind us physically, but also the chains that bind us inside, shame or regret, those kinds of things that sometimes are forced on us, and some of those chains we forge ourselves. Mm-hmm. So those are things that I tend to write about very often. And of course, that leads to issues of forgiveness, needing to offer forgiveness and to accept forgiveness. So I think those are very common for me. Most of my books lately have been set during World War II, but or shortly after. So it was nice to go back to the World War I era. I hadn't written about that since Promise Me This, that begins with Titanic and goes through World War I. So that was a nice thing to return to for me.
Yeah. What do you think initially drew you to historical fiction? Like, what about that genre rings your bell, if I can use that metaphor?
Well, I think that I feel comfortable there. I think I look for this. I should have said this in the question you just asked me, but I really do look for today's headlines in history. I think that there's nothing new under the sun. Whatever is going on now has happened in some form before. So it's not hard to find a place in history to set the story. And I think that setting a story there, because some of the issues I deal with are so difficult, like domestic violence or abuse, like in Nightbird Calling or 100 Crickets Singing, that it's easier to set that a bit distant, in a bit of distance. The perspective is easier than sometimes when it's right in front of us. I think it's easier for me. And I also think that I grew up hearing all kinds of stories from my parents and especially my grandparents, stories that were passed down about the Civil War, about Victorian and Edwardian times, and then of course World War I and World War II. My husband's family, the paternal side came from Germany in the early 1900s through Ellis Island. Wow. But when World War I came up, the father said, "We speak no more German, we are Russian," because it was so dangerous at the time to be German in this country. The sentiment was so strongly anti-German. So all of those things, I think all of those stories just have built a love in me for things in the past.
Great. I'm going to come back in a few minutes and ask you what historical fiction books have you loved and read so that we can maybe recommend some other books to people. But first, we have a question from our chat. And that is, I know this came from a participant who asked this question earlier. How long does it take for you to write a book from start until it's finished or published? How long is the process for that?
Well, it really varies widely. It takes me, and the shortest book time it's ever taken me to write a book is 7 months.
Wow.
But typically I would say about a year. That's it for my research, and it's typically about a year, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter.
Mm-hmm.
But then the process for publishing takes about a year. So that's how it ends. From the time I propose a book until the time it actually comes out might be 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever find yourself getting stuck, or do you and then also too, do you outline your books, or do you pretty much write intuitively as you go along? And maybe maybe you don't get stuck if you outline, but tell us your process. Like, well, what's it like for you to have an idea and then run with it?
I call myself a plotter with a pantser's heart.
That sounds like me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I need to create a long, very detailed synopsis for my sake. My publisher loves to have that as well, but I need that to keep me on track and keep me moving forward. And just as you observed, Susan, that way I don't usually get stuck. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I find that, oh, this really isn't going to work, and I have to go back and rethread. But plotting helps me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm the same way. I say that I am, what do I say? I plot by the seat of my pants. That's what I do.
There you go.
So everyone, if you've got a question for Cathy, go ahead and drop it in the chat and we'll get to it. And while you're doing that, Cathy, I want to ask you what you have been reading and loving lately.
I have been reading a lot lately. I read because I was driving back and forth to North Carolina quite a bit. I read or listened to the audio version of The Secret Book of Flora Lee by Patty Callahan.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a brilliant book with a fabulous narrator. But for actually reading, I recently read Melanie Dobson's The Wings of Poppy Pendleton, a very unique story, unique setting. Carrie Taransky's The Legacy of Longdale Manor really touched my heart and moved me, and I identified with some really strong themes in there. Two contemporary books I really loved. I loved Terry Gillespie's Sweet Rivalry. It's about twin sisters separated at a young age, reunited through their love of baking. And she's got this recipe in there for chocolate Dr. Pepper cupcakes with Frito icing. And I am going to create a gluten-free recipe from that. I just think that sounds so good. And then Robin W. Pearson's Until I Want No More brought home some really wonderful issues about family, empty nesting, and racial issues that I had not observed in those ways. And then I have to say, Susan, your book helped me so much in the passing of my mother, and that is As Bright as Heaven. And my mom passed away earlier this month, and that has been a great book. Reading great books is just such a wonderful part of our journey, and they are such companions through all the stages of life. I hope I never lose the ability to read.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I hear you. I'm sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
Do you have family members that also write? Do you feel like your writing abilities are a family gift? I know in my family, it kind of shows up in different people. Not everyone, but like my dad, my daughter. Do you like the writing gift among your family members? Was your mother a writer?
No, neither of my parents were writers. I had a great aunt that was a writer. My younger brother, Dan, is a wonderful writer of fiction and nonfiction. My sister has always written poetry and stories and journals and wonderfully encouraging letters. And my older brother writes sermons. He's a pastor. So I think it's interesting how we all write, but very different things.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that is great. So did you always want to be a writer? Did you come at this gig later in life? I came at it a little bit later. I was in my 40s before I wrote my first book, even though I knew from the very beginning, I knew I wanted to write. I just didn't know I wanted to be a writer. How did this career find you?
I knew from the time I was 5 years old, I wanted to be a writer. When my grandmother told me that I believe books were created by magic, and she told me that real people write books. So I said, oh, then can I do that? And she said, well, I don't see why not, but usually men write books, but first you have to learn to read. So I always knew I wanted to, but I did not sign my first novel contract until my 50th birthday.
Yeah.
I wrote for newspapers and plays and skits and different things like that, poetry, essays before that, but my first novel contract was not till my 50th birthday. So you're never too young to dream, never too old to step into that dream.
Yeah, I totally believe that. You're never too old or young to start something new and see it through. Is there anything that you wish you had known earlier about this writing life?
My big dream was always to write one story about the Underground Railroad, set in the Underground Railroad. And I thought if I could do that, that would be the be all and end all. And I was so surprised that once that got published, they wanted another one. and as silly as that sounds now, I really didn't know that. So I was not planning to write another one. I hadn't thought that through. And I wish that I had someone to mentor me, to give me the long view. So that's one thing I think is so wonderful today. There are so many ways to find, even if it's not a personal mentoring through the internet even, or classes or programs, all kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask if there's anything on the horizon for you. Like, what are you working on next? And this will be your last chance to ask any questions. Those of you who are watching, if you do have a question for Cathy, now is the time to put it in the chat. So, Cathy, can you tell us, if not in specific terms, in broad terms, what you're working on next?
Yes, actually, I have a book due to my editors the end of November.
Wow, I guess you're probably busy right now then. Huh?
Yes, it's a pretty busy time. And I won't say too much about it, but I will say that it is set on a Christmas tree farm in the mountains of Virginia, very close to where I live now, set in the 1990s with flashbacks to World War II. It's inspired by the whole idea of the parable in Luke 15, the prodigal son, or the running father might be a better name. And my premise is that we are all prodigals at some time in our life. We are all the judgmental older son at some time in our life. And we all have the opportunity to emulate and grow into a copy of the running father that will welcome and forgive. And it's the whole idea about family not being always who we imagine our family to be. But there is a great deal about love and forgiveness in that story as well. And I'm really enjoying the characters. I will say the three main characters, there's a woman 65, a woman in her 30s, and a girl of 10.
Oh, how
and
fun.
It's been so much fun to bring in these three different perspectives.
That's great. What drew you to a Christmas tree farm? Other than that just sounds wonderful.
I've always wanted to write a story set on a Christmas tree farm. And actually, this is over 50 years ago. I saw a Christmas tree sign, which I misread, and I thought it said Witherell Pickering's Christmas Tree Farm. And it didn't really say that, but I've always had that name in my mind. So in the story, it is Witherell Pickering's Christmas Tree Farm. That's not the name of the book because it's not all about Christmas. But yeah, I've just had that in my head for 50 years. So finally it's on paper.
So do you have all kinds of little things like that in your head? Like, do you have like an idea file in your brain or in your desk of all these little things that you've been collecting over the years?
I do have a physical file that I actually, what started this story is a newspaper article, I guess from the 1980s, that somebody had chopped the top off of a Christmas tree, just in a Christmas tree farm, just as a mean thing to do. And that set this story going. But yeah, I have little things filed in my brain, not whole stories, but little snippets that I want to investigate. Yeah,
That is
I
great.
love research. I know you do
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, I do too. It's my favorite part, I think, of writing, even though it's not writing at all.
Yeah,
It's the learning and absorbing and pondering and supposing and wondering. Yeah, I
mine
totally
too.
agree. Good. All right. So we have a comment from Kathleen. She says, "Thank you, Cathy." Oh, and she thanks me as well. She's going to get the book and she looks forward to the new one too. Thank you so much, Kathleen. Well, we've only got a few minutes left, everyone. It's been such a treat to have you here with Cathy and I as we've talked about her new book. And as Cathy, before we say goodbye, before we bring Bonnie back up to send everyone off to the rest of their evening, is there anything else that you wanted to say or that you wanted to add to our discussion?
I just want to thank you, Susan, so much. This has been a lovely interview. You're a wonderful interviewer, and I want to thank everyone at Save Ellis Island. This is a great opportunity for me, but also a great opportunity to support Ellis Island, which has
Absolutely.
had such an impact on all of our lives thanks to immigration.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you all for joining with us tonight and taking your time to be with us. I really appreciate
Very
it.
grateful. So Bonnie, can you come back in and tell everyone what they need to know as we wrap things up?
Certainly. On behalf of everyone at Save Ellis Island, thank you to Cathy and Susan for participating in this wonderful event tonight. I love when we have authors talking to other authors. It's so interesting. Autographed copies of Ladies of the Lake are available on Save Ellis Island's website shop at www.saveellisisland.org. And as noted throughout the program, these books have been donated. So when you buy a book, you are making your donation to Save Ellis Island. So you get to buy a book without any guilt, which is always the most fun to buy one.
Absolutely.
Join us next, our event on November 9th at 7 p.m. as we welcome Martha Bolton to our program for a discussion of her book, Dear Bob, Bob Hope's Wartime Correspondence with the GIs of World War II. I'm reading it now. It's really fantastic. You can register for that on our website, www.saveellisisland.org. Thank you again to our generous sponsors, Cowan Insurance Group and Tyndall House Publishers. We hope you will visit Save Ellis Island's website to become a member, to learn more about the restoration work being done and the ways you can donate to help save this national icon and preserve our history for future generations. Guided tours of the abandoned Ellis Island Hospital Complex are available. Tour schedules and further details are on our website. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Susan and Cathy. And I hope we get to see you guys again sometime in the future with new books.
I hope so too. Good
Me too.
night.
Good night.